Thank you to everyone for tuning in. My name is Min Sook Lee, and I'm with Carol Wall and Winnie Ng. We are in conversation about Asian solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with a specific focus on working class issues and working within the labor movement in Canada to build Asian solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but also to talk about the ways in which we can work in the labor movement to address, systemic racism, and to work to support the voices of our Indigenous, okay, sorry, can I redo that? Because you're gonna just start I find I meander and you want me to get straight to the point. Okay, all right, so welcome, thank you for joining us. This is a follow-up conversation. My name is Min Sook Lee, and I'm with Carol Wall and Winnie Ng. And we were part of the webinar talking about Asian solidarity with Black Lives Matter, working within the labor movement to do that. And we had a lot of questions that people submitted online through the chat, which we couldn't address in the live webinar that streamed. So what we wanted to do was take this opportunity to look at some of the questions and answer those in more depth. And this is what this recording is about. So welcome to this. Carol and Winnie, thanks for joining me and taking part in this.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Great, so I'm gonna get to the questions. And what we've done is taken all of the questions and kind of summarize them into some of the basic categories of concerns people raise. So the first one that many were asking about are, what are practical ways that we can dismantle white supremacy? And I'm just gonna add like a little bit of a focus on that, not just generally, but speaking very specifically, of course, to the labor movement and to our social justice communities that we work as part of.
So for me, this is the really sort of hard roll up your sleeves type of work that needs to happen, which means that unions, social justice organizations need to really start examining all of their policies, their practices, their procedures, and really start thinking about who isn't in the room and why is that? And how am I complicit in who isn't in the room? And because what is either my silence or not even seeing that this is an issue, how has that contributed to leaving people out, which is, especially at this time, is just not okay. I mean, I often say when I'm doing an anti-racism workshop, and I'll say to folks, I want you to just close your eyes for a minute, and I want you to think that you're in an all Black neighborhood. What's your thoughts? And be honest about what you breathe in and what you think about when you're in that situation, because a lot of it is really about what we breathe in on a consistent basis, which is centered on whiteness. And so this is the time for everyone to sort of step back and say, okay, to really dismantle it, and not just token gestures, looking at their policies and procedures and examining that, and being able to have a real conversation about things that before war sort of they wouldn't have talked about. That this moment and this reckoning, especially with Black Lives Matter, has finally been put on the table, such as defunding the police. So that's the work that needs to be done if you're really going to be serious about dismantling it, because I think for many union members, it's not visible. Unless you are Black, Indigenous, person of color, it's just not visible to them. And so it's making it visible and then acting. And, I guess for me today too, because who's been on my mind a lot is John Lewis with his going home. And that's what he said, when you see something isn't right, you've got to say something, and then you've got to do something.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. Winnie?
Yeah. I think when we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about systemic change. And at the webinar, we talk about racial capitalism. To me, I see the white supremacy and capitalism are so intertwined, right? And in that sense, it's when we're talking about dismantling, I think there are different levels. We need to start unlearning all the garbage that has been fed through media, through our family, through educations, what we haven't seen in our history books or in our kids' educational materials, and what we've been fed in terms of fake history, right? And then the other piece is, so that unlearning, it's an ongoing process. The other, and I think later on we can address a bit more, it's also that sense, as a non-Indigenous, as a non-Black person, what are some of our responsibility in not being seen as an accomplice, right? And so these are the pieces. I think there's a lot more soul searching that we need to do. Then at the individual level, I think it's important, as Carol has quoted from John Lewis, it's recognizing silence is not going to protect us, right? And so it's to speak out, to calling out inappropriate and racist behavior. But that piece, calling out, requires courage and practice, right? And it also depends on what situations. If you're in a workplace and you need this job for your survival, how you call out and how you do it becomes a strategic question, right? And calling out and to me, I think calling out, learning that's, to use our voice, to use our positions and insert our presence requires practice. And that initially, if someone, and I think, speaking personally, I went through my youth experiencing racial and sexual harassment and dare not to say a thing, right? So it's that sense of how do we acknowledge that and say, yeah, there are people, but we, much as you might not be, at this point be ready to start calling out, start the documentations, what you have seen, what you have witnessed, and use those moments, reflect on those and start anticipating if it happens again, how would you say it? How would you do it differently? And to me, I think these becomes part of that collective rethinking and collective actions in saying, yes, we need to call out, we need to bear witness, we need to be to be at the march or at the protest and to be there for each other. But it starts from building that sense of courage, building that sense of willingness to challenge the status quo, and then moving on to be recognizing you are part of the collective, you are part of the larger us that are going to take this issue on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that people are really hungry for very pragmatic, practical, concrete ways that white supremacy can be challenged. And I think what that question really puts forward to me is it's clear that answer depends on where you are. Mm-hmm. It depends on who you are, mm-hmm. and it depends on where you situate your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
And, yeah.
So I think there's different ways in which we dismantle white supremacy, depending on, what our life experience is mm-hmm. with racism.
Yeah, and I think it starts from us taking on the issue and not being afraid. And I think it's important to recognize that we, at different junctures, we should challenge this, that white supremacy, the acts of white supremacies are hate crimes, right? And so resourcing to use the whole Ontario Human Rights Commission, Canadian Human Rights Commissions, use whatever avenues that we have you know, recognizing it's going to take a long time, it might not come, but at least we are not going to be pushed back. I think that it's that sense that, you know, it's recognizing also that both as individual, as a collective, we have power as well to counter that white supremacy.
Yes, Carol.
Just to add what an important piece, Min Sook, that you brought up too. It's because one of the things I've also had a couple of conversations with folks that are doing anti-racism work, because people are exhausted. So it's thinking about organizational readiness too. Like, are you gonna, like, I want people need to take care of themselves. So you're not gonna put yourself at risk and put the organization isn't really ready. So then I would say take your energy and your resolve and what you want to do and join a group such as Black Lives Matter, or a group that is doing this work, so you can again get support, start to understand the strategies, because you will know your organization better than anyone else. And when it is that you can gain more support to then do the challenge of whatever it is that you need to challenge. Because there is risk in this work. There is definitely risk in this work. And let's face it, those in powerful positions of authority, if all of a sudden they're thinking they're going to be challenged, that's not something they're going to welcome. So it's, again, making sure that in doing this work, so you don't end up being burnt out or being marginalized, that you get the support that you need and sort of ready yourself and know the risks that you're taking. But I would hope that if you're committed, that you decide that that's what you're going to do, because that's who you are, and that's work you're committed to doing.
And I think finally, oftentimes when people are talking to me about dismantling white supremacy and asking, well, what can I do? One part of it is understanding it's external and it's internal, and it's about power. And recognizing that, whatever place you're in, if you're working within a union, local, or community organization, or whether it's in your family, ask yourself about the power map within that space. Who holds the power? Who's benefiting from the status quo? And also ask yourself, it's not actually about seeing Asian people. It's not about seeing Black people. It's not about seeing Indigenous people. It's seeing white supremacy. Because it's so ever present, it actually functions to be seen or presented as wallpaper, as almost this invisible norm. And challenge that, challenge the way in which it presents as a common sense, as a default axiomatic way of seeing the world and of assuming who belongs in the room. Who does the job application go out to? If you're part of a group that's developing a program, asking, who's this necessarily assuming the audience is, from what view or perspective are the program values and statements authored on. So those are ways in which you as Winnie said, it's an unlearning. Absolutely. Okay, so the second question that's very connected to that is not just what are concrete ways or practical ways, but also how can young people and youth make long-term strategies for dismantling white supremacy? Because it is certainly long haul work. And both of you mentioned that it's work that needs to be strategically done, that it's not work that you need to certainly think through what is your capacity, what's the capacity of the organization, what are ways to do it in a healthy way. So, there's always your own mental health concerns and considerations. But yeah, Carol and Winnie, what do you think are long-term strategies that people can use?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first. Yeah. And I think when we talk, it ties in with the last question. When we talk about dismantling white supremacy and dismantling racial capitalism, I think it's important to also have a sense and that visions and that big dream of what are we replacing it with? What would a truly integrative, multiracial, progressive working class movement look like? Right. And to me, I think this is where the young the young people, the emerging, I refer them as emerging leaders, their new ideas, their boldness, are what we are waiting for. In a sense, they are the leaders we've been waiting for. They're strident, they're creative, and they take no nonsense, right? It's, take a look at what Black Lives Matters, their group in pushing the issue of removing some of the statues, John A. MacDonald and Ryerson statues. These are acts of great creativity, but also it's such a visible statement, so in that sense, to me, I think this is where their strategies, their brain, their imaginations comes in. And I think it's, I'm always reminded that, we make choices in the present based on remembering the past and imagining the future. So in my role as an older activist, it's making sure that, I'm not here to mentor. I'm more here to, because they know they're doing it better than what we have done. But giving them that sense of what has taken place in the past, some of that history, and that they are actually, they can be bold. They are standing on the shoulders of all these activists and pioneers and leaders that have come before them, and that the making of future becomes part of that continuum of social justice movement, continuum of rebuilding, reimagining, but more implementing, making sure that, our grandchildren, their grandchildren won't have to go through the same old craps again.
Carol?
And just building on what Winnie said, I mean, I would like them to eliminate the thought that because they're young, they can't affect change. Because when we look at the movements today, Black Lives Matter, when we look at climate change, it is youth that's in the front of those movements.
Yes.
So as Winnie said, like, yes, be bold, be loud. And what I love about it is, and even when you look at Black Lives Matter, they weren't just pointing out issues, but they also talked about how to resolve those issues. Like, the defund the police. And when you think about them you think about just 4 years ago, we wouldn't even have been talking about that. Or when they did say that, they were dismissed. But again, they kept up they were clear about what it was they wanted, and they were clear in their communications, and they kept building. And here we are now, where it's mainstream to be talking about defunding the police. So as far as I'm concerned, again, talk to your elders to avoid mistake, research some models of resistance and sustainable change. But also understand that you're now walking your own path. And while, as Winnie said, I want to be not a mentor, but a co-conspirator, and definitely supportive of what they're doing. So listen and decide, where mistakes were made or things can be done better. But, just do what you're doing, because I find that the youth are really out in front, and they want to make real change that's going to give us a society where all of our humanity is respected and our potential is fully realized.
Okay, so can I just sharpen the question a little bit? Because I want to make sure that we talk to all the different kinds of identities and people who are part of this conversation. And very specifically, Winnie, how is it, do you think, that people in the Asian community in particular can speak to and locate their own experience with white supremacy, and speak to solidarity with Black communities, with Black Lives Matter, but also with Indigenous communities? I
think it's, for us as Asian community members who also experience, the anti-Asian racism, whose history, if you take a look at the history of the different communities within the Asian community, the indentured labor, the, all the humiliations and this systemic racism that we have, our forebearers have experienced, then I think it's important for us as Asian community members to recognize that we are building, in trying to build an alternatives and build a vision here, is we need to start by unlearning all the, all the false information that we have, and to be really cognizant. I think very often we are either, we try so hard to assimilate, to be seen as part of the model minority, and then at the other extreme, and then we get pushed back, and the harshness of the reality kept reminding us that we are forever seen as the perpetual foreigners. So it's in that pendulums, it's knowing which side we are on, and not to be seduced or co-opted by the establishments that, because, they appointed a few more Asians in the name of equity agenda, in the name of employment equity, in the name for management employers to check off, okay, they've hired a racial minority, quote unquote, right? And so, and it's recognizing that we are all in this together, the systemic barriers, the systemic discriminations that we face. I think there's a great line from Black Lives Matter saying there's no Black liberations without indigenous sovereignty. And to me, that encapsulates it all, is that if it's a system that would be good enough that would eliminate anti-Black racism, that would respect indigenous sovereignty, then it would be good enough, or even it would be ideal for Asian Canadians, communities, and so on and so forth. So I think it's recognizing that these are the same tools that's been used to divide us, and how do we move on? How do we take this on? And very concretely, I think one of the issues that we face a lot as Asians, and particularly the first generations of like myself who have come as an immigrant, as a foreign student, and growing up in colonized locations, it's the internalized racism that we carry. And to unpack that, to unlearn that, it's an ongoing, lifelong project, right? And so how do we take on that responsibility to unlearn anti-Black racism within our own community, say as a Chinese Canadian, within our own Chinese communities? Right now in the States, our friend Jojo just sent me a link saying, there's a group in a Filipino community in the States that are taking on the issue, unlearning anti-Black racism within the Filipino community. How can we do that within here in Toronto? How can we unpack and unlearn that? And then the second piece is learn the true history of Canada. When we say we are on native lands, what does that mean? How many of us have really pick up a copy of the Indian Act and read it from page to page to see how systemic the nastiness and the ugliness and the deviousness of systemic legislative racism? And then the other, aside from these two, is also learning our own history within our own community. And I'm going to just use an example. We all know last year, 2019, is the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. But how many of us were aware that in the same year, 1919, 100 years ago, the Chinese laborers in the sawmill industry in BC organized a massive strike, with over 1,500 workers leaving, all the sawmills and stop work to protest against the wage disparity between the whites and the non-whites. And it's those circumstances that we need to harness, we need to excavate our own the untold tales of resistance, the militancy that we have carried and nobody had known, and we keep reinventing the wheels. I think those are, and then I think part of it is also to make sure we don't speak within to each other's within the same orbit, to reach out to a broader community. I think we need also a much more strategic and proactive media strategies that can give space and give room for some of these real people's history and the authentic ones that is not clouded by all the dominant narratives. And to me, I think these are part of that unlearning and the relearning. And I think at the same time is, supporting what the indigenous activists, what, Black Lives Matter, I don't know more, in making sure that the education curriculums for our youngsters reflect the diversity of our communities, the history of our communities, and not just some groups. And I think part of it is also, I guess a lot of times it's, we end up working in silos, right? It's how do we make sure that when activists talk about green jobs, green economy, how do we integrate that to make sure that the equity agenda is reflected in a much more profound way? So, and my last point on this is saying, it's not good enough as a result of COVID to talk about recovery. Recovery for a lot of us in the equity communities, in the marginalized community, is going back to the same old inequalities. How can we seize this crisis right now and take it into an opportunity to do some profound transformative change? So the recovery is, in a way, to me, it's more a revolutions that would give us a new normal, something that we have never seen, that would combine the anti-white supremacy and anti-capitalism, capitalist agenda as one to push it ahead, because it can't be same old, just recovery back to same old is not good enough. And how can we make sure that, the whole green economy, when we talk about decent work, it's integrated with the Black, green, and red perspectives in it. Yeah.
Thank you, Winnie. That's very wide-ranging, comprehensive, and you're addressing many, many different points that we need to be speaking about when talking about, building Asian solidarity with Black Lives Matter, Black liberation, and Indigenous sovereignty. If I could just add a few things too from my own organizing experience, just to say you're right, so much of it is internalized and so much of it is externalized. So with regards to, even equity, I can see where I work at OCAD University, equity in large practical sense, hiring women. And after that wave of equity, it was hiring Asian faculty. And it's taken a lot more organizing to finally, this year in 2020, OCAD hired 5 new Black faculty tenure track. And it was a cluster hire. And a year ago, it was 5 Indigenous faculty. But I'm just pointing that out to you to sort of map out the ways in which I've seen Asian people being used in the white supremacist project as a proxy for whiteness. And our proximity to whiteness is used to sustain white supremacy. And we have to be honest about that. We have to challenge that. And we have to name anti-Blackness when we see it within our unions, within our workplaces, within our places of organizing. Because when we do not, as you said, speak to that, we're co-opted into this larger agenda that has none of our interests at stake. and has just constantly dehumanized and sidelined us, and is part of a hierarchy of power. So to locate ourselves within that hierarchy of power, I think is,
Yep.
And these conversations with our members, with our intimate community, relationships, and to name how anti-Blackness and colonial ways of behaving, of erasure, are reproduced. I think that's really paramount for us, and also to recognize. And again, to me, the more we talk about, Asian activism that understands our identities not located within, a default white gaze, moving away from that, looking at Asian activism in solidarity with Black liberation, Indigenous peoples, colonial, anti-colonial movements, the more we understand, our own histories and our own identities clearer.
Yeah, and sorry, I just want to add on, it's that it's an ongoing process, and it has also recognizing our own history is also tying in with the more global geopolitics context as well, and how a colonial system has globalized the world all around, and then coming back I think it's in that sense, it's not re-victimizing, but recolonizing us again, not just on physical and the identity, but also in the mindset. And to me, I think this is where the part of that ongoing challenge and the difficult work is as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Carol, do you want to add anything to that?
You can't help but think about how insidious, white supremacy is when you consider what it's done. Like it's built on dehumanizing and dehumanizing Black people, making their very existence be something to be feared, to believe this notion of inferiority. And so you have to ask yourself, either you believe the narrative of Black people and Indigenous people, who they also tried to do a genocide, and because they wanted them to assimilate or get rid of them. So you either believe that the notion that capitalism was built on, to have free labor, that they're inferior, to be feared, dehumanizing, or you have to say that it's the system. And so you either got to come down, because if you either believe that, or it not to be true, and so you must say it's the system, which means then we have to work to dismantle this system. And I find that, just like sort of the defunding the police, sometimes that immobilizes people to some degree, because because it's been so intricate into everything that we do. Because not only, you're talking about internalized racism within the Asian community, we have internalized racism within our community as well. It is basically the model, never mind model minority, it's the white model. And we're all trying to walk and be within this white model and to survive in this system that's been set up. So how do you survive? You make yourself more like, you try to be acceptable. You try to not challenge them. You try to, just be quiet, like all of this. So that's what I mean. The whole, so which is why there's also a fear that the work that we're doing as Black, Indigenous people, racialized people, if we get together, if we all finally said, okay, they're terrified, because let's face it, we would be a power to be reckoned with. I mean, economically, politically. So that's what they're, so that's part of the division too, of keeping, well, let's give them a few more crumbs because they're more centered toward whiteness. You put it all together, and that is a very fearful thing for them, to think that we are now starting to break this down and we're going to work together to make sure that we live in a society that respects all of our humanity in all of the various identities we live in. So I think this is important work. It's not easy work, but I'm glad that we're having these conversations, because we've had them maybe separately, and we need to have them separately, but we then need to have them together and say, how do we work together as a solid block? Because I mean, I'm telling you, we do have power. We have economic power. We have political power. We're just not using it because we've allowed ourselves to be divided. We've allowed ourselves to be co-opted into this whole system that basically has never benefited any of us. Never.
Thank you, Carol. Now, some questions emerged from our webinar, which people wanted to have a more clear idea about how unions, how people working within their own unions, how can they get their unions who see themselves as champions of equality, of equity, fair workplace, how can people get their unions to champion issues that affect racialized peoples beyond a tokenistic way, beyond having like one, rep in a committee, or having a committee, or that kind of thing. Like, we're looking at transformational structural change within union power, within labor organizations. Carol and Winnie, you both have decades of experience working in labor and organizing in many different spaces within the labor movement. So what are your thoughts on this change within the labor movement, addressing anti-Blackness within the labor movement, addressing racism, systemic racism within unions, white supremacy, and colonial union power structures?
Well, again, this is a time for me to think about, because unions are, this is what unions should be championing. And so they're very well placed, and this should be the raison d'etre. So now it's a time to have a shift of thinking within unions, and that's going to take some work. But I do believe that, again, and I think that how you change things is from the bottom up, not necessarily the top down. So it means about union members within union locals starting to have these conversations, because let's face it, I mean, while we've talked about, I think within the labor movement, we like to talk about equity as something that's an aside instead of integral to what a union is. And so now it's, okay, now we need to have the conversation about how do we make that integral to every single thing we do, and all of our partnerships with social justice movements, with climate change. So how do we make that integral? So that's a whole shift in thinking that needs to happen. And I think union members are well placed to start putting that on the agenda. So you're building from the bottom up and getting support, and basically saying, okay, it is time for us, never mind equity seats, we need to take a look at the entire organization and how do we make this integral to every single thing we do. And so to achieve that, what needs to change? And that means looking at, their political structures, their policies, their hiring policies, their education, and having that conversation. I mean, I don't think there are, like, even talking about anti-Black racism, I don't think that's a real comfortable discussion that many unions could have today. I think that they're recognizing that, and I think that they want to. So again, it's getting them ready to say, you've got to have this conversation. And that happens because of the current structure. That happens with members who vote on their leaders, putting this on the agenda and thinking strategically and starting to work with other union members who also care about these issues to make sure it goes forward, and starting to say to their leaders, I want a speaker from Idle No More to come here and really start talking to us and have a real conversation about what we need to do to really support that movement, because it's a movement. And I want someone from Black Lives Matter to come, and let's not be afraid of having the conversation about defunding the police. So that's what needs to happen, and that's going to be a real shift, and it is going to have to be long-term, and it is going to have to be ongoing. But that's what needs to happen now. And I believe there's a lot union members who were in this moment so stirred by what they saw with George Floyd and the deaths that have happened here, that I really believe there's a commitment now to do that. And so leaders within the labor movement would be wise, instead of waiting until they have to get pushed, to start thinking about, how do I as a leader start really modeling what I should be as a social justice movement? Like, what do I need to do within my sphere of authority to make real serious changes, and having the discussion with members who may not be in agreement with this, who may be racist members. Like, what do we need to do to make sure that we're going to move in a direction that supports reimagining the movement? And one of my heroes is A. Philip Randolph, and I've read a lot of what he did in his, and because the dominant labor movement didn't really want to recognize or want to have Black workers, which is why he started his own separate union and was instrumental in the civil rights movement in making sure the civil rights bills actually ended up getting passed. And his big focus was always on what he called social uplift. He said, that is what unions have been built for. We must speak, not just for our unionized member, for the poor, for the disenfranchised. That is, so unions need to really, I think, in some ways, they have gone away from some of those things. And it's not that it's not important to be bargaining and for economic achievements here, but let's face it, for 2 decades, there's been no economic progress made. I mean, people are losing ground, and they're losing ground because we're not seeing holistically of the labor movement that this is about. Let us focus on the low wage and poor that are within that eventually, so that they are union members, but that has to be the focus, because that uplift addresses so many issues of education, of health, of housing, of climate change. I mean, so that needs to be the focus. So this is a great opportunity, I think, for the labor movement to really say, what, given all that's gone on, what do we need to really focus on, and what do we need to change within our structures to ensure that we continue doing what we should do, which is making sure that we're basically in the foreground of movements such as Black Lives Matter, that we're in complete solidarity with Idle No More, that we are taking on these issues and standing as co-conspirators, because that's where we're supposed to be. That's what we're to do. And it can only help build the labor movement and make it stronger. So this is I think this is a great opportunity. And I think you will get members a lot more engaged, a lot more inspired, actually wanting to take on leadership positions, because I know there's a lot of incredible people who, instead of putting their focus there, have put their focus within their community groups and just sort of walked away. And that's sad. That does not benefit the movement.
Thank you, Carol. Winnie.
I think to start off, and I mentioned some of that in my presentation earlier, to start off, I think it's important to remind ourselves that as racialized members of the labor movement, we are the union. It's our labor movement too. The labor movement doesn't belong to just the whites. And I think if the more we could keep that frame in mind, then the more we can be assertive and inserting ourselves in the different spaces that are quote unquote traditionally allocated or been dominated by the white labor brothers and sisters. I think it's also important for all of us to recognize that how can we use our positions within the labor movement with its relative power and privilege. What are we willing to give up to really dismantle white supremacy, right? And I think these are the questions that if we talk about the essence of labor movement is solidarity, and injustice to one is an injustice to all, and injury to one is injury to all, then how does that manifest in real actions? When you call someone a brother or a sister, be they an indigenous or Black or other racialized member, is there the same relationship that is being forged? Mm-hmm. Or are we doing it just for the optics, right? And I think those are some of that fundamental questions that we need to be asking, we collectively within the labor movement. And then the other piece, and Carol talked about the integrating race into everything that we do within the labor movement. I've made the suggestions that be it in union organizing, recognizing most of the racialized folks work in smaller workplaces with precarious employment. How can we make sure that all these unions, why can't we lower the bar and start organizing folks that in workplaces that are under 50 or under 100 employees? So there'll be a wider, how much do we spend in organizing and educations versus in other area, be it advocacy and lobbying. So I guess I'm sort of going into more the bread and butter of the labor movement, what we do. And for example, shop stewards, for a lot of immigrant members, a lot of racialized members, shop stewards is the only one they see in the workplace, right? They are supposed to be, quote unquote, the eyes and ears of the union, the representatives. And a lot of our members don't even know the full name of the union. So they refer to the shop stewards. How often, I think the union, as a union system, we need to recognize, ask the right question. The question is, how often do we take up people's complaint about discriminations, people's complaint about racism, people's complaint about differential treatments? Or are they being, a lot of times they are being cast away as, oh, they are just, these are only jokes, and you have a chip on your shoulders and so on and so forth. Those are, so I think it ties back into, for a lot of workers that I've organized, that I've worked with, it's people organize, join a union, not just for the money. Yes, it's important to improve the security, but it's more, they see the union labor movement as a forum where they can reclaim their dignity and respect. Mm-hmm. And when they join, when they become part of union members, do we accord them with that level of dignity and respect that they were hoping for? And very sadly, it's most of the times we don't. And I'm using we collectively as the labor movement. We see them as, oh, they add to our membership fold. And then, oh, we can selectively appoint a couple of them as our equity trophies. And they be placed on mentors, on the union mentors, and it'll be cut, and it'll be brought out for media opportunities. But I'm saying, we need to revamp and rethink that all again. I think it'll be important for unions, beyond making good statements and extending solidarity letters to Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More and all the other groups, it's do accounting, do an audit within your own unions as an employer. Who have you got and where are they? Mm-hmm. Right? And then how do we engage? How do we do collective bargaining? So how do we engage folks in meaningful collective bargaining process by integrating their issues? How much is equity issues being integrated into collective bargaining? How much is the health and safety concerns of some of these long-term care workers integrated in the whole conversation of recovery of COVID, when frontline PSWs are being beaten up in the group homes and so on and so forth. It's, these are the issues that for the white folks, it might not be seen as the key issues, but I think they need to have that empathy and that recognition that these are issues that define who we are as racialized members of the community. And if they don't take it seriously, the labor movement will continue to go down. Just take a look at south of the border and what has happened. And then my last point I just want to mention is, in terms of leadership, particularly for white male leadership, how much are you willing to give up or step aside so other folks can come up? What's your succession plan for your own unions? Mm-hmm. And who are the ones that you are mentoring? Who are the ones you are clearing the path for? Who are the ones that you're taking to go out for a drink or to a baseball game or to golf clubs? So I'm saying, all the leaders need to be much more self-vigilant and, self-conscious as to what you are doing, because what you are doing right now would have an impact 10, 20 years from now. And your legacy, whoever legacy as a white leader, would be measured by what follows 10 years from now. And I think it's important that every leader within a labor movement take up this issue seriously and do the right thing, because that's how your legacy and leadership will be judged here on end. Thank you.
Okay, Winnie and Carol, thank you both for your answers. I think that, Carol, you're pointing out the necessity for the labor movement to understand itself with visionary transformative goals that challenge capitalism is so important right now, because Winnie and you have both made the links between racism and capitalism, racial capitalism. Mm-hmm. And if unions do not, and the labor movement don't identify dismantling capitalism, critiquing capitalism, and recognizing the normalization of poverty, the normalization of exploitation of people's humanization and the division that happens and that is, produced out of racism, systemic racism, that, which normalizes anti-Blackness, which normalizes and, is part of a colonial project. If labor movement can't see a broader visionary political struggle as part of its mandate, then as, both of you have pointed out, the future and the existence or the utility of the labor movement for, the liberation for all peoples and for the transformation of a society that is, decidedly unjust. That is what's called into question when we're asking the labor movement to identify the working class struggle, the struggle for labor rights is aligned to the struggle against racism. against systemic racism. These are not divided issues. These are not siloed issues. These are intertwined. And fighting anti-Black racism is core to the labor movement's own agenda. They have to understand that structurally, as well as in terms of a unique committee, or as you've said, both of you, really nice sounding statements, symbolic statements. So the structural change must be, recognized as that's the core work of the labor movement. But how about this very specific to that? And then Winnie, you can come into that, but I just want to add this. What about for folks who are racialized within the labor movement, who see themselves, who are racialized, who are Indigenous, who are Black within the labor movement, and they see maybe they're a rank and file member, maybe they have one kind of position, but the leadership of that local or that union is all white. What kinds of strategies would you offer from how to change things from within systemically? I guess drawing upon some of the works and campaigns that you have done and been part of. And I'm thinking, of your organizing, Winnie, within hotels, garment workers, and I'm thinking, Carol, of all of the educational work you've done in terms of, working around anti-racism within the labor movement. But even Carol, you running for the leadership position of the Canadian Labour Congress, that was such a defiant and a bold and a visionary act, right? A very concrete act in terms of challenging white supremacy within the labor movement struggle. So, what's the thoughts that you would give for people who are within the labor movement trying to think, well, how do I change this when the entire power structure is white?
Well, I was going to add on the fact that, from my own experiences, be it in the garment industry, in the hospitality sector, with the unions, we have a critical mass of racialized members, right? And the unfortunate part is the top tier of leadership end up to be mostly white, right? Then you also have unions or workplaces where the racialized members are definitely at the minority. So, that the representation is not reflected even in the workplace and therefore not in the union. So I think that there are two different scenarios here. But my sense is that for those who, one needs to be, I think there are two processes. One is, it's how do we turn rank and file members from being just a member, a dues paying member, to become an activist. So that process of engagement. And to me, I think what the labor movement has missed is using the issue of discrimination, using our fight for dignity and equity as a real platform in engaging these members who are always seen as the others, right? So if it's a whole process, if more integration, if they see themselves more reflected, be it in education, in bargaining, and everything else in the unions, then there's a sense of engagement, or and then for those who are second language speakers, that, if the union would consider translating some of the materials, then it becomes a whole lot more accessible. But that's the information part. The other piece is, it's the linking with each other. And to me, I think this is where it comes in. It's you being in a union, that means you're not alone. And for a lot of us who take on the issue of anti-racism, it's making sure that you have allies, making sure you have alliance, you have rapport with all the other workers who share the same experience, lived experiences, right? In confronting systemic racism. And so that becomes a critical mass that the unions, the leadership can't afford to just cast aside. And to me, I think this is where the caucuses comes in, the equity agenda comes in. But then the next piece is how do you make sure these doesn't become just like a, window dressing bodies, right? And that, that and members of these committees are actually become sort of the additional puppets for the white male leadership. And this is where, in that sense, part of that unlearning of internalized racism, and also learning and asserting self-determinations for all of us comes into a much larger prominent role. It's how do we engage in a way that we have our agenda being advanced, not being co-opted. And I think the more we can be, and this is where I think a lot more work through ACLA, CBTU that folks can do, is making sure that, we have the leadership training, not just the regular leadership, but more the engaging on deeper conversation. So people have both the courage, the confidence, and the and the stridency, the resilience in speaking out and pushing for the space. Because my sense is, we have to, we can't afford to be polite anymore. And maybe I've done a lot of that myself. So part of that reflection is saying, unless we shake the trees would never fall. Right. And so this is where it comes in. And this is where I'm taking so much hope on all of you, on the younger generation, is you are asking the right questions that we dare not to ask when we started in the labor movement. And to me, I think that's progress. And I think the white leadership need to be aware and be fearful that we are coming and we are not stopping.
Have you answered this last question, which is basically how do BIPOC union members who are activists who want to address systemic racism within their local positions, actions in our way, how do they make change from within like that?
I think you have to be really practical in a few ways. First of all, it's really important because we know there's informal and formal structures within unions. So it's important that you engage both the formal and informal. We also know that most unions do have, they call it workers of color, conferences and caucuses. So it's to really get to know your community within that union, and also allies within that union, and start to really understand what the informal and formal structures are. Once you know that, and make sure that your leadership is about, it's not about you. Your leadership is about making sure that all the issues we've been talking about, that's their vision for the union, to make sure that anti-racism is integral to the union. So if that's your leadership and that's your vision and you want to put that forward, that's when you start knowing the formal structure, knowing what you need to do, and gaining support from the caucuses, that you're actually making concrete action, that you actually, when you're going to run, you have a platform because you've already worked within your local or within a council. You've already worked on very concrete ways of moving the issues of equity within, and anti-racism and anti-Black racism within your union. So you make it clear. So you don't be discouraged by the fact. I mean, when I would come into a room and I would always think about who was missing, that made me then think of strategies of what I needed to do to make sure when I walk in that room again, I'm not the only Black person in the room. There is an Indigenous person in the room. There's other racialized people within the room. There's other LGBTQ plus people within the room. So that was always my observation. It's the same as when I travel, I look at who's cleaning the floors and so these are things that you must be aware of. And again, for me to really move this issue, I want leaders who are going to be committed to that. It's not just about a career move for them. It's about a real vision of what the labor movement could be, should be, and making that so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's very powerful. Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Winnie. Thank you both for making the time to answer these additional questions that came up we could not address in the webinar. And I think that a lot of labor activists, particularly though, you know, racialized activists, Black activists, Indigenous activists, within the labor movement, we don't hear enough about how we can strategize in concrete ways and structural ways to build power within the labor movement. Because sometimes it's one, as you have both mentioned, you know, you feel isolated, you feel alone. And sometimes there's this whole competition that we're set against each other. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if there's only one seat in that equity committee or in that, you know, power structure, I think that, you know, creating this space and time to talk about this is so meaningful, and we need to do more of these kinds of conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.